The world knew Lou Reed as rock's uncompromising poet. But on September 7, 1973, backstage at Madison Square Garden, he faced a choice that would define his entire career. Mick Jagger, the most powerful man in rock and roll, stood in front of him with something rare in his eyes: genuine fear. What Jagger said in that moment, and what Lou Reed did in response, would become one of the most talked about incidents in rock history, whispered about in recording studios and tour buses for decades to come. But the story didn't begin that night in New York. It started 3 months earlier in a London recording studio, where a conversation between two titans had already planted the seeds of what would become rock's most public act of defiance. David Bowie was there that night, and what he witnessed made him realize that Lou Reed was willing to destroy everything: his career, his relationships, even his safety, for something far more important than fame. The question was whether 80,000 people at Madison Square Garden were ready to witness that destruction. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the untold stories of rock's most legendary figures. This is the kind of history that changes how you hear every song. The summer of 1973 marked a peculiar moment in rock history. The Rolling Stones were preparing for their largest American tour ever, a massive undertaking that would cement their status as the biggest band in the world. Meanwhile, Lou Reed was navigating the aftermath of his transformation from underground cult figure to something approaching mainstream recognition. His album, Transformer, produced by David Bowie and Mick Ronson, had given him his first real commercial success with Walk on the Wild Side, a song that somehow smuggled stories of transgender sex workers and drug dealers onto AM radio stations across America. The relationship between Lou Reed and the Rolling Stones had always been complicated by mutual respect and fundamental differences in philosophy. Jagger admired Reed's uncompromising artistic vision, the way he wrote about the dark corners of human experience that most rock stars avoided. Reed, for his part, recognized Jagger's genius for performance and spectacle, even if he privately considered the Stones too commercial, too willing to sand down their edges for mass consumption. When the invitation came for Lou Reed to open for the Stones on select dates of their 1973 tour, it seemed like a perfect marriage of underground credibility and mainstream success. But there was a tension building beneath the surface that few people outside the inner circles of both camps understood. Lou Reed was working on new material that would eventually become his album Berlin, a devastating song cycle about addiction, abuse, and the complete disintegration of a relationship. The songs were darker than anything he had written before, unflinching in their portrayal of human cruelty and self-destruction. More importantly, Lou had been planning something special for the Madison Square Garden show, something that would push boundaries in a way that made even his previous provocations seem tame. To understand what happened that September night, you need to understand what Lou Reed had been through in the years leading up to it. The electroshock therapy his parents had subjected him to as a teenager, attempting to cure his bisexuality, had left scars that went deeper than anyone in his audience could imagine. Those treatments at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens had been brutal, a violation that Reed would spend his entire life processing through his art. The Velvet Underground had been his first attempt to channel that trauma into something beautiful and terrible, creating music that sounded like the inside of a damaged mind, all feedback and drone and uncomfortable truths. But the Velvet Underground had ended badly, dissolved in bitterness and creative differences that left Lou feeling betrayed by people he had considered family. The solo years that followed had been a struggle to find his footing, to figure out who Lou Reed could be without the band that had defined him. Transformer had given him commercial success, but it had also created a new problem. Suddenly, there were expectations, pressure to deliver hits, to be palatable, to play the game that every other rock star played. Lou Reed had never been good at playing games he didn't design himself. In the months leading up to the Rolling Stones tour, he had been spiraling deeper into drug use, primarily speed and heroin, the twin poles of his chemical existence. His relationship with Rachel Humphries, a transgender woman who had become his partner and muse, was both the most authentic connection of his life and a source of constant tension with the music industry executives who wanted to keep that aspect of his life hidden from the public. Rachel understood Lou in ways that few people ever had, saw through his defensive aggression to the wounded person underneath. But their love existed in a world that was hostile to its very existence. The songs Lou was writing for Berlin were explicitly about this darkness, about the ways love and addiction and violence could become so tangled that you couldn't separate them anymore. One song in particular, a piece called The Bed, described in graphic detail domestic violence and sexual degradation. It was not a song designed to make people comfortable. It was not a song designed for arenas full of Rolling Stones fans who had come to hear Brown Sugar and Jumpin' Jack Flash. And it was exactly the song that Lou Reed had decided to perform at Madison Square Garden. The decision had been made weeks before the show, but Lou hadn't told anyone outside his band. Not the tour promoters, not the Rolling Stones management, and certainly not Mick Jagger himself. But somehow, through the gossip network that connected every recording studio and rehearsal space in New York, word had gotten back to Jagger about what Lou was planning, and it terrified him. September 7th, 1973, Madison Square Garden pulsed with an energy that only the biggest concerts could generate. 80,000 people creating a wall of sound and anticipation that vibrated through the concrete bones of the building. Backstage, in the maze of corridors and dressing rooms that separated the performers from their audience, Mick Jagger was pacing. Those who knew him well recognized the signs of genuine anxiety, the way his usual confident swagger had been replaced by something more agitated, more uncertain. Lou Reed's dressing room was a study in controlled chaos. Band members tuned instruments while Lou sat in front of a mirror, applying the dark eye makeup that had become part of his armor, his face a mask of concentration. Rachel was there, sitting quietly in the corner, a calming presence in the pre-show tension. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and sweat and the particular electricity that comes before walking onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of people. The knock on the door came 45 minutes before Lou's scheduled set time. When it opened, Mick Jagger stood there, and the room's energy shifted immediately. Jagger didn't walk into rooms so much as command them through sheer force of presence. But tonight, there was something different in his manner, something that Lou's band members would remember decades later as deeply unusual. He asked if he could speak to Lou alone, and after a moment of loaded silence, the room cleared, leaving just the two rock legends facing each other. What happened in those next 20 minutes would become the subject of intense speculation and rumor for years to come. No recording exists of that conversation, no transcript beyond the fragmented memories of the two people who were there. But in interviews given years later, both men would confirm the basic outline of what transpired, though their interpretations of it would differ significantly. Jagger started carefully, professionally, talking about the show, the energy of the crowd, how electric the night felt. Lou listened without speaking, his eyes never leaving Jagger's face, waiting for whatever was really coming. When Jagger finally got to it, his voice carried a weight that Lou had never heard from him before. He asked Lou not to perform the bed. He explained that there would be families in the audience, young people who had come to see the Rolling Stones and weren't prepared for the kind of brutal content Lou was planning to unleash. He talked about the sponsors, the venue management, the potential for the whole tour to face backlash if the show went too far. But then Jagger said something that cut deeper than any of the professional concerns, something that revealed the real reason for his visit. He told Lou that he was worried about him, that the path he was on, the darkness he was diving into, it wasn't sustainable. Jagger had seen too many brilliant musicians destroy themselves, and he didn't want to watch Lou Reed become another casualty of the mythology they had all helped create. Lou Reed's response was not immediate. He lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely clear. He told Jagger that he appreciated the concern, but that the bed was the most honest thing he had ever written. He talked about the electroshock therapy, about the years of being told he was sick, wrong, something that needed to be fixed. He explained that for most of his life, he had swallowed his truth, hidden it, protected other people from the discomfort of his reality. And he was done doing that. The conversation became more heated. Jagger argued that there were ways to be honest without being deliberately provocative, that art could tell the truth without alienating the audience. Lou countered that Jagger's version of truth was sanitized, packaged for mass consumption, that the Rolling Stones had long ago traded genuine danger for the simulation of it. The air in the dressing room grew thick with tension. Two completely different philosophies of what rock and roll was supposed to be crashing against each other. What most people didn't understand about Lou Reed was that his aggression, his confrontational stance toward the world, was fundamentally defensive. Every harsh word, every deliberately offensive lyric, was armor protecting the desperately vulnerable person underneath. The teenager who had been strapped to a table and had electricity sent through his brain. The young artist who had been told his sexuality was a disease. The musician who had poured his heart into the velvet underground only to watch it fall apart. That person needed protection, and Lou had built walls of noise and provocation to provide it. Standing in that dressing room, facing Mick Jagger's plea to soften his art, Lou felt all of those old wounds reopening. It was his parents asking him to be normal, his early record label asking the Velvet Underground to be more commercial. Every person who had ever suggested that his truth was too much, too dark, too uncomfortable for public consumption. And the most painful part was that Jagger wasn't wrong about the potential consequences. Performing the bed at Madison Square Garden could damage Lou's career at the exact moment when he was finally achieving mainstream success. It could alienate the audience, offend the sponsors, give ammunition to every critic who wanted to dismiss him as a provocateur rather than a serious artist. Rachel had been the one to help him see it clearly during one of their long conversations in the apartment they shared, surrounded by the detritus of their complicated life together. She had asked him what he was more afraid of, failing commercially or betraying himself artistically. And Lou had realized that the answer was the latter, that he had already compromised enough, that if he started pulling punches now, there would be no end to it. The whole point of everything he had suffered through, every painful experience he had survived, was to get to a place where he could tell the truth without apology. But there was another layer to it that Lou couldn't fully articulate to Jagger, something about the nature of witnessing and the responsibility of art. The bed was not just about shock value or provocation. It was about forcing an audience to confront the reality of domestic violence, the way it happened in bedrooms and apartments all over the world while people looked away. It was about the connection between intimacy and violence, love and destruction, the same connection that had defined so much of Lou's own life. To perform it in front of 80,000 people was to refuse to let them look away, to insist that if they wanted the glamour and excitement of rock and roll, they also had to face the darkness that lived alongside it. Jagger made one final attempt, speaking more personally than he had before. He talked about his own struggles with the persona he had created, the ways that being Mick Jagger the rock star sometimes felt like a prison, cutting him off from genuine human connection. He suggested that maybe there was value in maintaining some boundaries between the artist and the audience, in not giving everything away. But even as he said it, Lou could see that Jagger knew it was futile, that the decision had already been made long before this conversation started. What Lou Reed said next would become one of the most quoted exchanges in rock history, though the exact wording varies depending on who tells the story. According to Jagger's version, Lou looked at him and said simply that he had to do this, that it was the only thing that made sense. According to Lou's version, told years later in an interview with a journalist he trusted, he told Jagger that if the Rolling Stones represented rock as spectacle, then he needed to represent rock as truth, and that the world needed both. But he could only be one of them. The conversation ended without resolution, without agreement, just an acknowledgement that they were on fundamentally different paths. Jagger left the dressing room, and Lou sat back down in front of the mirror, his hands shaking slightly as he continued his pre-show ritual. Rachel came back in, read the situation immediately, and sat down next to him without speaking, her presence saying everything that needed to be said. The opening of Lou Reed's set was electric in all the wrong ways. The garden was packed, a sea of people who had come for the Rolling Stones but were willing to give the opening act a chance. Lou walked onto the stage with his band, the lights creating harsh shadows across his face, and launched immediately into Vicious, a song that was aggressive enough to get the audience's attention, but still within the bounds of acceptable rock performance. The first 3 songs went well enough. The crowd was responsive, if not ecstatic, and Lou's band was tight, delivering the hard-edged rock that had become his solo signature. But everyone who knew what was coming felt the tension building, the sense that something was about to shift. Lou's guitar tech would later describe the feeling as like watching someone walk toward a cliff edge, knowing they were going to jump but powerless to stop it. Between the 3rd and 4th songs, Lou paused longer than usual, letting the audience noise settle into expectant silence. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was conversational, almost casual, explaining that he wanted to play something new, something from his upcoming album. He didn't mention the title, didn't prepare the audience in any way for what they were about to hear. And then he counted off the band, and the bed began. The song started with a simple, almost pretty guitar figure that belied the horror of the lyrics about to come. When Lou started singing, his voice was tender, intimate, drawing the audience in before the words themselves landed like punches. The description of violence, of degradation, of the terrible intimacy of abuse was unflinching. There were no metaphors to hide behind, no poetic distance to soften the impact. It was the sound of someone refusing to look away from the worst parts of human behavior, and by extension, refusing to let the audience look away either. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and visceral. Some people stood in shocked silence, unable to process what they were hearing. Others began to boo, their discomfort manifesting as anger. A section of the audience started heading toward the exits, unwilling to stay for the rest of the song. But there were also people who stood completely still, transfixed by the raw honesty of what Lou was delivering, understanding on some level that they were witnessing something important, even if it made them profoundly uncomfortable. Backstage, Mick Jagger stood watching from the wings, his face unreadable. Members of his entourage were panicking, talking about damage control, about what this meant for the rest of the tour. But Jagger just stood there, watching Lou Reed commit what everyone around him was calling career suicide. And in that moment, despite his earlier objections, despite the very real professional consequences, there was something in his expression that might have been respect, or recognition, or perhaps just the acknowledgement that Lou Reed had answered his question in the most definitive way possible. The song ended, and the garden was filled with a mix of applause, boos, and stunned silence that created a sound unlike anything most people there had ever heard at a concert. Lou didn't acknowledge the reaction, didn't try to explain or justify or apologize. He simply moved on to the next song, continuing his set as if nothing unusual had happened. The band played tight and professional, but everyone on stage could feel the shift in energy. The way the audience was no longer just listening to music, but actively engaging with questions about what they were willing to accept, what they were willing to witness. The rest of Lou's set passed in a kind of heightened reality, every song taking on additional weight in the aftermath of the bed. By the time he played Walk on the Wild Side as his closer, the song that had brought him mainstream success, it sounded different, edged with irony and defiance. The audience sang along to the famous bass line, but now they knew that the man on stage was not interested in being their friendly neighborhood rock star, that his commitment to truth ran deeper than commercial considerations. After Lou left the stage, there was chaos in the backstage area. Tour management was furious, talking about breaches of contract and acceptable content clauses. Record label executives who were there were making frantic phone calls, trying to control a narrative that was already spinning out of their grasp. But Lou Reed was nowhere to be found. He had left the building immediately after his set, walking past the recriminations and consequences, Rachel at his side, heading out into the New York night. The Rolling Stones went on and delivered their show, a masterclass in professional rock performance that the vast majority of the audience had actually come to see. Jagger was brilliant on stage as always, commanding and charismatic, giving the people exactly what they wanted. But those who were paying close attention noticed a moment during Midnight Rambler, one of the Stones' darker songs, when Jagger's performance seemed to take on an extra edge, as if he was testing his own boundaries, seeing how far he could push while still staying within the acceptable parameters of mainstream rock spectacle. In the days following the Madison Square Garden show, the music press exploded with coverage of what had happened. Critics were divided, some calling Lou Reed's performance an act of artistic courage, others dismissing it as pointless provocation. The controversy did exactly what Jagger had feared. It became a distraction, a story that threatened to overshadow the music itself. But it also did something else, something that neither Jagger nor Lou could have fully predicted. It started a conversation about what rock music could be, about the responsibilities of artists to their audiences, about the line between entertainment and confrontation. Lou Reed never regretted performing The Bed that night, though he would rarely discuss it in interviews, preferring to let the act speak for itself. Berlin, when it was released later that year, was met with savage reviews, with critics calling it depressing, self-indulgent, and commercially suicidal. But it would eventually be recognized as one of the most important albums of the 1970s, a work of devastating emotional honesty that expanded what rock music could express. The relationship between Lou Reed and Mick Jagger never fully recovered from that night, though they maintained a respectful distance over the years. In one of his final interviews before his death in 2013, Lou was asked about the Madison Square Garden incident, and he gave one of his rare, genuinely reflective answers. He said that Jagger had been trying to protect him, and that he understood and even appreciated that. But he also said that sometimes protection is just another word for limitation, and that he had spent enough of his life being limited by other people's comfort. The most interesting coda to the story came years later, when Jagger was giving an interview for a documentary about the history of rock music. The interviewer asked him about the most surprising moment of his career, expecting him to talk about one of the Stones' legendary performances. Instead, Jagger brought up that night at Madison Square Garden, watching Lou Reed from the wings. He said that in that moment, he realized that there were different kinds of courage in rock and roll. There was the courage to get on stage in front of thousands of people, which he knew well. But there was also the courage to be willing to lose everything for the sake of honesty. And that was something rarer, something that maybe he had never quite had himself. The recording of that night exists in fragments, bootleg recordings of varying quality that circulate among collectors and fans. The bed is there, preserved in all its uncomfortable, uncompromising glory. A document of the moment when Lou Reed chose truth over acceptance, art over career, himself over the expectations of everyone around him. When you listen to it now, knowing the full context, knowing what was at stake, the song takes on even greater power. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing an artist can do is refuse to compromise, even when everyone is begging them to. The Madison Square Garden show marked a turning point, not just for Lou Reed, but for rock music itself. It demonstrated that the genre could be more than entertainment, that it could force confrontations with uncomfortable realities, that it could refuse to look away from the darkness that lived alongside the glamour and excess. Whether that was progress or self-destruction remained a matter of debate, but it was undeniably significant. Lou Reed spent the rest of his career walking that line, creating music that pushed boundaries while maintaining his absolute commitment to honesty. He never became as commercially successful as the Rolling Stones, never filled stadiums with people who sang along to every word. But he created something else, a body of work that stands as a testament to the power of refusing to be anything other than exactly who you are. Consequences be damned. In the end, both men were right in their own ways. Jagger was right that there are costs to uncompromising honesty, that pushing audiences too far can limit your ability to reach them at all. But Lou was also right that without people willing to take those risks, to refuse to soften the truth for the sake of palatability, rock music would lose something essential, would become just another form of safe, controlled entertainment. The night of September 7th, 1973, in that dressing room conversation and in the performance that followed, represented a fundamental choice about what kind of artist you want to be. Mick Jagger chose spectacle, grandeur, the ability to move millions while staying within boundaries that allowed those millions to remain comfortable. Lou Reed chose truth, confrontation, the willingness to alienate and disturb if that was what honesty required. Rock history needed both approaches, but only Lou Reed could do what he did that night. Stand on stage in front of 80,000 people and refuse to give them what they wanted, offering them what they needed instead, whether they recognized it or not. If you found this story revealing and want to explore more untold moments from rock history, please like this video, share it with fellow music lovers, and subscribe to our channel. The real stories behind the legends are always more complicated, more human, and more fascinating than the myths we build around them. Thanks for watching.